in terms of whatever is out there, um, as far as history is concerned, or historical material is concerned. So right from that stage to this point onwards, what what do we do in order to, you know, talk about the whole politics of adaptation and how it is done? From the earliest days of cinema in 19th century Europe, adaptation from such diverse resources has been a ubiquitous practice in filmmaking, something that is common. And you see that more so in, in European cinema, that because the literature is extremely strong, the literature is extremely potential. Um, so when you tend to borrow, you need to have you have so much material existent in order to work upon. It always helps, when you have existent material to work upon. It helps incredibly. Film adaptations also interpolate scenes and invent characters. This is especially true when a novel is part of a literary saga. When we talk about a literary saga, we're talking about series of books, like for example, a Game of Thrones or a Harry Potter series or a Lord of the Rings or um, Mahabharata for that matter, where there is this huge, humongous amount of material that is there, and one book, one novel could be there. So you try to crisscross and try to integrate characters or invent characters and try to take characters from here and there and try to play around a bit with that. And we draw from different sources. For example, if Lord of the Rings wouldn't have been, a trilogy or a quadrilogy, you would have it would have been made just into one film. Then what would you do? You would kind of take one material, and since you have to make one film, you'd primarily integrate it, integrate the incidents or uh, dialogues from one book or one novel and put it in, or multiple ones and put it in a single film. Um, Filmmakers also tend to, develop new characters and create sub stories or play a bit around with the plot or subplots, and which might not be existent in the source material at all. There is that possibility which exists, and then people tend to, add and remove. It's they take the creative liberty. The screenwriters and the filmmakers take the creative liberty to decide whether they want to, use something which is existent or create a new character around it, um, which might give or add dimensions or layers to the screenplay writing process or the screenplay process for that matter. Then, given the anticipated audience for a film, the screenwriter or director or movie studio may wish to increase character time or to invent new characters. What does that mean? That it is largely left to the creative people. So the screenwriter or a director or studios are into the creative business. So many times you would come across actors or artists complaining that the screen time has been reduced. On paper, it was much more. But when finally they see the film, there has been a lot that is edited off. So that brings courts controversies and all, but many times those things, those are business calls, creative business calls, something best left to the people. So that way, as a screenwriter, you got to be flexible enough to understand that this is something crucial if you want to spend some time in the industry and establish yourself. Uh, Things that you write might be altered on the stage. On the set, there could be improvisations which might reduce your lines. So it depends. Unless you are established one, or unless things that you've written exactly mean something. So sometimes new characters are also inserted or invented. For example, in Iron Weed, there was this very short appearance of a prostitute called Helen. Now, the film studios anticipated the female audience for the film and had Meryl Streep doing the role of Helen. And she became quite successful and popularized because of that short character that she played in that film. And something that was not there, but later on added. Characters are also sometimes invented to provide a narrative voice. So you don't see the character in the film, or uh, you don't read about the character in the screenplay, but it's the character's voice through which, or it's the character's point of view through which you tend to uh, you know understand or interpret the film. So it's their POV. So many times that also happens, that they work as a narrative voice. And stage plays are frequent source of film adaptations, like I told you. Many of William Shakespeare's films plays, including all the tragedies, whether it is Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, they're all adapted, and comedies are also adapted, whether it is Comedy of Errors. So what happens is what Shakespeare has done is he has created so much of layers in the play itself that they are one of the most widely um, not just adapted plays, widely performed plays. So the primary source of material itself is extremely strong and potent. So you have quite a bit of catching up there. Then when you read the plays time and again, when you're adapting the play, are you adapting the play in the current setting? Are you retaining the play in its original setting? Shakespeare wrote in 17th century. Do you want to continue presenting it in the film of a 17th century society, or you want to contemporize it, which is what has happened in most of the cases? So you would see that in Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, which is a brilliant film of, you know, uh, an adaptation of Macbeth. Then Bad Sleep Well, like inspired by Hamlet, ran from King Lear. You'd see that these are Kurosawa's films. Then Kurosawa has done this trilogy, and then Vishal Bhardwaj in India has tried his attempt to pay homage to Shakespeare by adapting, Maqbool in 2003, Omkara in 2006, and then Heather, which is based on Hamlet. So Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth, all these three tragedies, great tragedies by Shakespeare, has been adapted by Vishal Bhardwaj, and quite significant interpretations, and so much of cinematic language and uh, is offered in terms of those narratives. How when you take up an age-old play which is extremely popular and which has been widely adapted, how much of faith you must put into the text in order to completely reinterpret and base it in your contemporary settings, which suits the politics, which suits the zeitgeist of our period. Because that part is crucial, that we understand the period in which we are living in, and while telling us the cinematic story, what sort of a story you want to tell, while borrowing from a 17th century material. Because human emotions more or less remains the same, only the politics and the settings would change. So in such sort of a situation, what do? Are you going to stay true to the original characters, or you are going to reintroduce characters? Scenario, whether you are sticking to the narrative or you are moving away, and if you are moving away, what is your politics of moving away? As a screenwriter, forget about being a filmmaker. You have to keep thinking from the point of view perspective of when you are trying to integrate those or um, characters, the characters which are not from Shakespeare's play but from your film. How much of the Shakespearean blood and bone is there in those characters, and how much you are offering in terms of novelty. Another way in which Shakespearean text has been incorporated in films is to feature characters who are either actors performing those texts or characters who are somehow influenced or affected by seeing one of Shakespeare's plays within a larger non-Shakespearean story. Generally, Shakespeare's basic themes and certain elements of the plot will parallel the main plot of the film and become part of the character's development in a way. This is what I was trying to tell you, that there is always a meta narrative that keeps playing. So when you're performing, how much of um, when you're performing, I'm saying what when the actors are performing, they are performing on the basis of the lines that is written by you as a screenplay writer, and they're being directed. They are not drawing from the play. They have an overall understanding of the play. So parallelly, what you are doing or what you have done in the screenplay and what they are trying to do would influence how the narrative is going to proceed in one way or the other. Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet have been mostly used in this way. There's so many addition of characters that are there. Macbeth also to that extent, you will see. And it becomes interesting to engage in that sense. Then comic books, particularly superhero characters, if you would see, they have been long adapted since the 1940s. And initially it was serialized, movie serials that were created in order to attract children, Superman characters and Batman characters. It's very successful movie adaptations from comic books. 2000 onwards, you have X-Men, then Spider-Man, and you have the entire, Marvel Cinematic Universe and DC Cinematic Universe, which started adapting a lot of superhero films straight from comics. And then you have Ghost World, From Hell, which is by Alan Moore, then Sin City, which is again by Alan Moore, and 300, again adapting it from primarily from a graphic novel. So comic book adaptations are different than novels. Um, there is a variation in terms of how you are portraying the characters. Uh, Essentially, because what happens in novels, um, it's primarily the written word. In comic books, the written words are minimized, whereas there is a visual description. So the visual description works as a visual template to write, which is fine. But you still have to write a lot of dialogues to make it sound like cinema. So what you do is you try to capture the backstory of the characters and then try to adapt it into a particular storyline where the dialogues and the origins kind of get relatively simplified and it appears presentable, unless you are doing an animation film. If you are doing a live action, if you are writing a live action film which is borrowed from comic book characters, you need to stick to the adaptation process of how comics could be done in that sense. Self-contained graphic novels, miniseries, many of which do not feature superheroes, can be adapted more directly, such as in the case of Road to Perdition, 2002. It's again a brilliant film. you get a chance, please do watch it. Or V for Vendetta. Um, I prefer the graphic novel over the film when I look at V for Vendetta, but uh, again, brilliantly done. So he's the then in particular, Robert Rodriguez did not use the screenplay for Sin City, but utilized the actual panels from Frank Miller's series um, as storyboards to create what Rodriguez regards as a translation rather than an adaptation. So that's the terminology that is you would come across people using it from time to time. That whether is it a translation or an adaptation, or is there a difference between a translation and an adaptation? So when you're translating, you're basically um, trying to understand the spirit of the text and creating your own thing. When you're adapting your originals, you try to stick to the original material as much as you can and interpret it slightly in a different way. So people use it loosely, interchangeably, and there's a lot of conceptual overlapping that happens in terms of that. So it depends on how your politics plays up and how you want to push it forward. Novels and films are such different species that it can feel unnatural to marry the both. After the adaptation, the only thing they will share will be a story, the setting, and the characters. Remember that part. Once that is done, what you have is what a, um, how much you have borrowed from there. The story settings and the characters would more or less remain the same, but um, once you have a screenplay on hand and when you look at the novel, thing would have completely changed. A novel is considered to be a completed art form, and one author writes the book, one reader reads the book at one time. If it is a successful book, many people, even millions of people, will read that same book. While each reader will see the story through their own imagination and personal interpretation, the printed words will never change. Okay, so everybody will read the same thing. But the issue that happens is in terms of a film, that's why the onus is primarily on the director because you're making a film. Um, the viewers, the audience who are going to watch a film do not necessarily read the original screenplay. Most of them do not read the original screenplay. They end up, very few people end up reading the original screenplay. So the screenplay will evolve with the input from collaboration between the director and the creative team. Basically, primarily the screenwriter and the director, and then it'll be a transitioning document. Unlike a novel which is printed and done with all its error, with all its faults and foibles, it remains the same. So everyone is going to read into the same thing. Whereas screenplay, it's a document that keeps evolving. That's why you have a shooting draft, and in between there are numerous drafts that happen. And adapting a novel to a film is rather like renovating a house. You'll have to destroy it from inside before you rebuild it into something beautiful again. It's called, I mean, this sort of an analogy works because when you are adapting, the original becomes the old house that you're going to renovate. So you have to deconstruct all the elements that are there. Plot points, characters, transitions of characters from stage A to stage B, uh, reintroduction of characters, all those things you'll have to consider and then try to break out from there and create your own material which would look beautiful and something that you would see if you get a chance to actually read the original plays or original graphic novels and see how much of it had changed. Especially, for example, I'll talk about two. One is um, Vishal Bharadwaj's Shakespearean trilogy, whether it is Makbul or Omkara or Othello, or Heather or Sin City. for that matter, what Rodriguez has done. Because these are, Sin City, I have read the 6-part book. I have read Othello. I've read Macbeth. I have read Hamlet, the original plays by Shakespeare. And I have also read the screenplays that are written by uh, various screenwriters who worked as part of the team of Vishal Bharadwaj while developing the screenplays for uh, Heather Omkara and Maqbul. So, so I know what sort of a sea change that can happen. So when you are trying to do that, the task on you is to understand the spirit of the characters or the setting uh, in which you are basing your film. It doesn't really matter what Shakespeare has done. Shakespeare wrote something 400 years ago. 80% of what he has written back in the day is still relevant. So the politics remains the same. The characters might remain the same. You are trying to borrow the spirit of the characters. You are trying to borrow from what the characters in a universe look like in terms of emotions, in terms of conflicts, in terms of happiness. What changes is the context in which you are adapting. If you look at Heather, Heather is adapted into the sectarian politics that exist in Kashmir. So it's not something Shakespeare wrote 400 years back. So when you're trying to adapt that into a setting that is based in our period, you have to recreate that part. So your understanding of Shakespeare's play as well as that of the contemporary settings is important. You know, to be equally aware of the politics and the political context or the social context in which you are adapting the play. So if you want a successful adaptation, you need to, you know, uh, you need to understand the setting in which you are adapting as well. The challenge in adapting a novel for a film is how to stay true to the source as you proceed to bend it into a medium of the film. Understand nobody is interested in reading your screenplay at the end of the day. You are writing because that is going to remain as a source material based on which a film would be made. The end product is going to be a film. The end product is not another written material like a novel or a play. When a play is written, it is not written just for reading. No? It was made to be performed. So that's why they adapt it into a proscenium setup. It's written keeping the stage in mind. Similarly, when you're writing a film, you have to keep the set in mind and then write. To adapt a prose into a screenplay, you have to think about the story differently. And lastly, about the scenes, you need to keep that in 3 dimensions. While in a, the novel, you still operate in a 2 dimensions. Also, to accommodate the average length of a film that ranges between 90 minutes, and mostly screenplays work between 1.5 hours to 2 hours, which means primarily 90 to 120 pages. That's the standard. If you are adapting a book which is 500 pages or 600 pages, how do you contain that within that 90 to 120 minutes? So how much of a novel's material can you borrow to adapt it into a 100-page screenplay? That's where cinematic language would come into play. For example, I'll give you one example to run through this. When Metal Gear was adapted, early on it was clear that the screenwriter need to step away from the novel as written and think about retelling the same story. Now, in the case of Metal Girl, the screenwriter and the novelist both were the same. They were adapting it, as in the case in many cases that has happened. Like Mario Puzo um, did significantly contribute to the script of Godfather. So when you are doing so, how much of it you can borrow from the original material or the book, and then how much you would add. What you need to keep in mind is how the story has to be told. Okay, there is a 500-page novel that is there. What sort of a story I want to tell? I want to tell a cinematic story. I don't want to tell a novelistic or a literary story. People have to see a literary story. They would rather read the book instead of watch a film. Cinema uses a certain grammar. So as a screenwriter, you need to keep those grammar in mind. What would be the look and feel of that screenplay material that you are developing? Or how would those characters from the novels look like when they appear on screen? Many a times the novelist might not have been that descriptive in terms of presenting that. You have to keep that thing in mind, that you are using the language of film. You are not using the language of the book. Then the structure part, especially when you are planning an adaptation, what elements of the story would stay and which one could be cut out? What works for your politics? Like I told you, what works for you? What about the characters? What about the events? The key incidents in the film, or the locations in which you want to place this thing? What parts could be eliminated? Okay, these are the things that are not contributing significantly to the screenplay. So let me throw it off. And what parts have to be kept to portray the theme of the story and the main character's story arc? Because that's how you're going to show the progression in the film. Otherwise, you're stuck at one point. What would change? What would stay the same? So you have to keep those things in mind. How much of the original story is going to end up in your screenplay, and how much you have added for dramatic purpose or dramatic effect for that matter. And over a period of time, through production and editing, those things will change, but that's not your primary botheration as a screenwriter. But you do keep in mind that those sort of changes are going to more or less happen. So if you are smart and intelligent, you would keep those things in mind while developing the screenplay. Because remember, you are adapting something from a page to for the screen. So people are going to watch and get enthralled. People are not going to read and imagine and then get enthralled. So whatever you're offering has to be instant in nature. Then lastly, while keeping the structure of the film, the story in mind, remember that it's going to be different than the structure of the novel. The way the novel would have been written could be chronological in nature, while your attempt to write the screenplay could be different. You might be considering to hyperlink the film or trying to change the structure of the film. So it entirely depends on you. So what is the best timeline for the event? You need to primarily do that and see whether it is fitting the bill or not. Surprise is an important element in screenwriting. So the twist and turns to the plot, which is one of the literary devices, but used brilliantly in screenplays. And what it does, it holds the attention of the reader. Right now, since you are doing a screenplay, it is going to hold the attention of the discerning readers and then the film viewer, whoever has not read the book or has not read the screenplay for that matter. They are just watching the film, which is what happens in the case of common audience mostly. Then a novel has also has to move forward, but doesn't have to build on emotion in the same way as a film. In cinema, the intensity matters. In a printed book, which is in a fiction format, it's primarily literary engagement. But in cinema, the way cinema is going to move you um, is going to do so with intense presentation. So what you are riding on is characterial emotions. That's why you feel for those characters, irrespective whether they're good or bad. You subconsciously root for those characters because they are written in that way. I'll come to that part a little later when we are discussing this. A film takes the audience on an emotional ride. The film must hold you on your seat in rapt attention for one sitting for 90 to 120 minutes. So that is the kind of humongous responsibility that you have on your shoulders while writing the screenplay or developing the screenplay. So the audience need to be sucked into the narrative, into the drama, into the climax. So whatever you are going to, write will be crucial in that sense because there is an underlying responsibility on you. Book could be of possible interest, but it can have a different impact. You when you're watching a film, you are watching it in one way. You are holding the attention of yourself for that period of time. Um, Whereas when you are watching a film, if you break and watch, that intensity gets lost. But you can always come back to the book. This is what happens. So the book is structured in that way that you can put a bookmark and then come back and read. So yeah, that's more or less what I want to talk about regarding adaptation politics. And I'll proceed to the discussion part. Take questions.